You don't wake up confused for no reason. Confusion doesn't appear spontaneously in a healthy mind. It is built. Federal reinforced. At first, everything feels like a misunderstanding. An unresolved conversation. A strange feeling you ignore because you love, because you trust, because you believe you might be overreacting. And that's exactly where it begins. Emotional manipulation doesn't show up as violence. It shows up as doubt. You start questioning your own reactions. What used to be a clear boundary now feels like being too sensitive. What once was certainty becomes, maybe I misunderstood. And slowly, without noticing, you hand something extremely valuable to the other person. Control over the narrative of your reality. When someone manipulates, they don't need to lie all the time. They just need to distort. To minimize. To reverse roles. You say something hurt you, and instead of being heard, you're met with defensiveness. You express pain, and receive irony. You ask for clarity, and get silence. This dynamic turns you hyper-aware of yourself. You think before you speak. You replay messages in your mind. You calculate reactions. Not to grow, but to avoid conflict. And this is the most ignored early sign. When you start adapting too much to keep the peace, while the other person never changes anything. At this point, confusion is no longer temporary. It becomes a permanent internal environment. You feel tired without knowing why. Anxious even when everything seems fine. Guilty without having made a clear mistake. And most dangerously, you begin to trust yourself less than the person causing this state. That is manipulation. Not explicit control, but making you doubt your own perception. If you feel something is wrong but can't explain it. If you always leave conversations feeling smaller, confused, or emotionally indebted. Maybe the problem was never your confusion. Maybe someone slowly taught you not to trust yourself. And recognizing this doesn't make you weak. It makes you aware. There's a reason you feel lost around certain people and clear-minded when you're away from them. That's not coincidence. It's strategy. Confusion is one of the most effective tools of emotional control because it doesn't imprison the body, it imprisons the mind. When you're unsure of what you feel, what you think, or what's real, you become easier to guide, easier to silence, easier to shape. A manipulative person is rarely predictable. One day they show affection, the next they pull away without explanation. Today they validate your feelings, tomorrow they dismiss them with a simple, "You're overreacting." This constant back and forth creates ongoing inner imbalance, keeping you always trying to readjust. And it's exactly this continuous effort to adapt that drains your emotional energy. You start living in a state of alert. Analyzing tone of voice. Decoding short messages. Looking for signs of approval or rejection. Not because you want control, but because you've lost the emotional stability you once had. Confusion also comes from the other person's lack of emotional responsibility. When you try to talk about something that hurts, the response isn't dialogue, it's deflection. The focus shifts. The topic gets inverted. Suddenly, you're defending yourself over something that was never the original point. This constant displacement creates a silent effect. You begin abandoning your own feelings to manage the other person's emotions. Your pain becomes secondary. Your discomfort starts to feel inconvenient. And before you realize it, you're apologizing for feeling. Manipulation isn't only what's said, but what's never clarified. It's silence used as punishment. It's ambiguity used as a weapon. It's the lack of response that forces you to fill the gaps with guilt. A manipulative person rarely says, "I don't want to." They prefer to confuse. They prefer to leave you waiting, imagining, adjusting. Because while you're trying to understand, they maintain control. And the most dangerous part of this dynamic is how it disguises itself as a complex, deep, intense relationship. But intensity is not depth. Often, it's just emotional instability disguised as connection. When someone truly cares, they bring clarity, not confusion. They bring safety, not anxiety. They bring dialogue, not psychological games. If you have to work too hard to understand where you stand. If you feel like you're always trying to fix something invisible. This isn't complicated love. It's control in disguise. And you're not weak for falling into it. You were just trying to connect with someone who needed confusion to feel powerful. There is a form of manipulation so subtle that by the time you notice it, it's already deeply embedded, gaslighting. It doesn't begin with direct aggression, but with small distortions of reality that make you question your own memory, logic, and emotional sanity. At first, it's simple phrases. I never said that. You misunderstood. That only happened in your head. Individually, they seem harmless. Repeated, they become devastating. Each time your perception is denied, something inside you shifts. You begin to doubt what you saw, what you heard, what you felt. And when your version of reality stops being trustworthy even to yourself, the other person's version takes its place. Gaslighting isn't about convincing you of a specific lie. It's about something much deeper, convincing you that you are not a reliable source of truth. Over time, you stop trusting your instincts. That internal warning system, once protective, gets ignored. You learn to rationalize discomfort, justify the unjustifiable, explain away the inexplicable. And this doesn't happen because you are weak. It happens because you are human. The manipulator observes your reactions, identifies your insecurities, and uses them as a map. They alternate validation with denial, creating emotional dependency. When you're validated, you feel relief. When you're denied, you feel confusion. And you start seeking that relief more and more, relief that only they seem to provide. This creates a vicious cycle. You need the person who hurts you to feel safe again. The most cruel part is that gaslighting often comes wrapped in apparent rationality. The manipulator presents themselves as calm, logical, balanced, while you're portrayed as too emotional, too confused, too unstable. Over time, you accept this role. You start describing yourself as difficult. You apologize for reacting. You fear confrontation. Because confrontation means risking being invalidated once again. And when this happens repeatedly, silence feels safer than truth. But here's the essential point. Constant confusion is not a personality trait. It's a symptom. It's the result of someone repeatedly tampering with your perception until you lose your footing. You didn't become confused because you can't think. You became confused because someone benefited from it. Recognizing gaslighting is the first step to reclaiming something that should never have been taken from you, trust in yourself. One of the most insidious signs of emotional manipulation is when a relationship stops being a place of support and becomes a testing ground. Nothing you do feels enough. Nothing you offer feels final. Love, which should be a refuge, turns into an evaluation. You feel like you're constantly being watched, measured, judged. As if you have to prove, all the time, that you deserve to be there. At first, this may look like the other person's insecurity. You try to understand, to give in, to show more. You believe that if you love better, explain yourself better, or become more patient, the tension will fade. But it doesn't. It just changes form. Every gesture gains weight. Every word can be used later. Every boundary becomes evidence against you. The manipulative person creates invisible criteria. Rules that are never clearly stated, but that you feel when you break them. A shift in tone. Sudden distance. A cold atmosphere that appears without warning. And then the cycle begins. You try to figure out what you did wrong. This constant search for approval slowly erodes your identity. You stop acting based on what you feel and start acting based on what you're trying to avoid. Avoid conflict. Avoid disappointment. Avoid emotional abandonment. Love, at this point, is no longer spontaneous. It becomes performance. You don't love freely anymore, you love with fear. Fear of losing. Fear of making mistakes. Fear of being insufficient. And this fear doesn't come from nowhere. It's cultivated. Every time you show something genuine and receive coldness, indifference, or devaluation, you learn that feeling is risky. That being yourself has a cost. Manipulation thrives in this state of emotional alert. Because someone who is always trying to get it right doesn't have time to see the game. They're too busy adjusting. What makes it even more confusing is that sometimes this same person appears extremely loving. Offers affection, attention, intensity. These moments act as rewards. They make you think, see. When I do it right, it works. But this isn't healthy connection. It's emotional conditioning. You begin associating love with extreme effort, constant vigilance, and self-abandonment. You learn that affection must be earned instead of simply received. And little by little, without noticing, you accept a relationship where love is something you prove, but never feel safe in. Healthy relationships don't demand constant proof. They don't make you feel like you're on trial. They don't use fear as a bonding tool. If loving has become synonymous with tension, anxiety, and excessive self-control, that's not emotional intensity. It's psychological exhaustion. And you are not failing at love. You're responding to a system that was never designed to hold you. Guilt is one of the most effective tools of emotional manipulation because it doesn't require external surveillance. Once guilt settles in, the person begins to self-regulate. They punish themselves. Silence themselves. Correct themselves before the other even needs to act. At first, guilt appears subtly. A sharp comment. A sigh. A look of disapproval. You feel something is wrong, even if you don't know exactly what. And then the repair attempt begins. You apologize. Adjust your tone. Adapt. Over time, guilt stops being linked to clear actions and becomes a permanent state. You feel guilty for speaking too much, feeling too much, wanting too much. Guilty for needing. Guilty for existing with complexity. The manipulative person rarely accuses directly. They imply. They suggest. They leave things unsaid. And you, trying to preserve the relationship, do the rest of the work. You fill the gaps with self-criticism. Interpret silence as disapproval. Distance as punishment. And so, you become responsible not only for what you do, but for the other person's mood, their well-being, the stability of the relationship. An emotional burden that was never yours. Guilt also distorts your sense of justice. You begin to rationalize behaviors you once found unacceptable. He only acted that way because I triggered him. She spoke like that because I insisted. There is always a justification that ends with you. This creates a deep inversion. The one who hurts becomes the victim, and the one who feels the pain becomes the guilty party. And when you believe this narrative, you lose something essential, the right to emotionally defend yourself. You begin accepting crumbs of affection as compensation. You're grateful for minimal gestures of care, as if they were great concessions. Because deep down, you believe you are always in debt. Guilt keeps you trapped because it convinces you that leaving would be unfair. That distancing yourself would be selfish. That setting boundaries would be cruel. And so, you stay, trying to repay a debt you never incurred. But here is the truth that dismantles this cycle. Healthy relationships are not maintained by guilt. They are sustained by shared responsibility. You are not responsible for regulating another person's emotions. You are not guilty for feeling pain. You do not need to erase yourself to be worthy of affection. If you carry a constant weight, even when you try to do everything right, this is not emotional maturity. It's conditioning. And freeing yourself from guilt doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop sacrificing yourself to keep something alive that only works when you shrink. One of the deepest consequences of emotional manipulation is not immediate suffering, but the gradual loss of yourself. You don't notice it at first. There's no clear moment when everything changes. There are only small daily abandonments that seem harmless, until they become permanent. You start by giving in on simple things. An opinion you no longer express. A boundary you choose not to reinforce. A desire you postpone. All in the name of harmony, understanding, it's not worth arguing about this now. But what you call emotional maturity is actually distorted self-preservation. You're trying not to be rejected. Over time, you no longer know clearly what you want. Your choices begin to prioritize the impact on the other person. You ask yourself, will this cause conflict? Will this push them away? Will this disappoint them? And when the answer seems to be yes, you retreat. Even if it means stepping away from yourself. This process is silent, but devastating. Because you remain physically present, but emotionally you start to disappear. Your tastes shrink. Your spontaneity fades. Your identity begins revolving around maintaining the relationship. Manipulation grows stronger when you become predictable in your self-denial. The other person learns how far they can go. Learns how much you can endure. Learns that you will always give in a little more. And not because you want to, but because you believe losing yourself is less painful than losing the bond. This is the point where the relationship stops being a meeting between two individuals and becomes an emotional survival system. You're not there because you feel whole. You're there because you fear the emptiness you imagine exists outside of it. And that fear is not natural. It was built. Little by little, the manipulative person makes you believe no one will understand you like they do. That no one will accept you as you are. That you're too difficult, too intense, too complicated. And if you believe that, you start accepting less than you deserve. You convince yourself that this exhaustion is the price of love. That every relationship requires sacrifice. But sacrifice is not self-erasure. Love does not demand that you disappear so the other can remain comfortable. When you need to vanish to be accepted, the bond is no longer love, it's dependency. And here's a hard but liberating truth. Anyone who only stays when you shrink was never truly with you. Reclaiming yourself is uncomfortable, because it requires facing the fear of loss. But continuing to lose yourself is a much higher cost. You were not born to fit into emotional molds. You were born to exist whole. If it were just a matter of awareness, you would have already left. If it were only lack of information, the exit would be simple. But emotional manipulation doesn't trap through logic, it traps through attachment. You don't stay because you don't understand what's happening. You stay because there's a deep emotional bond that mixes affection, fear, hope, and guilt. And this mixture confuses the brain, weakens decisions, and paralyzes action. The manipulator doesn't present themselves as a villain all the time. On the contrary, in many moments, they are exactly what you always wanted. They know how to be attentive, sensitive, present. And these moments create a powerful emotional memory that makes you believe that version is the real one. So when the behavior shifts, you don't think this is abuse. You think they're going through something. You think they're not always like this. And that hope of return becomes an anchor. The human brain seeks coherence. When it receives contradictory signals, affection and coldness, closeness and rejection, it tries to resolve the conflict. And almost always resolves it by blaming itself. Because it's easier to believe you can change than to accept that the other person chooses not to. There is also the fear of emptiness. Not just the emptiness of physical absence, but identity emptiness. When so much of your emotional energy has been invested in this relationship, leaving feels like losing a part of yourself. You think, what if I'm overreacting? What if I regret it? What if no one ever loves me like this again? These questions don't come from nowhere. They were planted over time through subtle devaluation, comparison, and emotional isolation. Slowly, your self-esteem erodes until the idea of leaving feels more terrifying than the pain of staying. Another factor is intermittent reinforcement. Love isn't constant, it appears unpredictably. And that creates dependency. The brain starts chasing the good moments as rewards, ignoring the continuous damage. It's the same mechanism that keeps people stuck in gambling, betting, and emotional addictions. Hope becomes more powerful than reality. And when you try to pull away, guilt returns. The person may promise change, show remorse, display vulnerability. Not necessarily because they will change, but because they sense a loss of control. This doesn't invalidate your feelings. But it explains why leaving hurts so much. Breaking this cycle requires more than courage. It requires emotional clarity. It requires stopping negotiations with yourself. It requires accepting that love should not demand survival. You are not failing for still being there. You are caught in an emotionally sophisticated system. And understanding that doesn't weaken you. It prepares you. Before you rationally understand that you're being manipulated, your body already knows. It reacts first. It sends signals you try to ignore, justify, or normalize. But the body doesn't negotiate with narratives, it responds to what is lived. You feel constant tension. A tightness in your chest without a clear cause. Fatigue that doesn't go away with rest. Anxiety before simple conversations. Immediate relief when the person pulls away, followed by guilt for feeling that relief. These reactions are not exaggerations. They are warnings. The body reacts to emotional incoherence. When words and actions don't align, when affection and rejection alternate, the nervous system enters a state of vigilance. You never fully relax, because you don't know what's coming next. And living like this has a cost. You may develop insomnia, difficulty concentrating, low energy, irritability. Small things affect you more than they used to. Not because you've become weak, but because you're overloaded. Emotional manipulation creates an environment of invisible threat. There may be no shouting, but there is instability. No physical aggression, but unpredictability. And to the body, unpredictability equals danger. That's why you may feel better away from the person, even if you still care about them. You may feel more like yourself when you're alone. You may regain clarity with distance. That's not emotional coldness. It's self-regulation. Many people ignore these signals because they've learned to prioritize the other person's logic over their own internal experience. They've learned that love means enduring. That discomfort is normal. That suffering is part of it. But the body doesn't lie. If you need to emotionally prepare yourself just to talk to someone who claims to love you, something is misaligned. If your body goes on alert before a meeting, a message, a call, that's information. And that information matters. Manipulation works as long as you distrust your internal signals. As long as you convince yourself you're overreacting, being dramatic, too sensitive. But sensitivity is not a flaw, it's refined perception. When you begin listening to your body, mental confusion decreases. Because the body doesn't participate in psychological games. It responds to real impact. You don't need dramatic proof to validate your discomfort. You don't need to wait for something serious enough to happen. The fact that you are constantly tense is already reason enough. Your body is trying to give back something manipulation took from you. Safety. And safety is not an emotional luxury. It's a foundation. When you begin to see clearly, something curious happens. Some people say you've changed. That you've become distant. That you're cold. That you're not the same anymore. But most of the time, what they're feeling isn't your coldness, it's the loss of unrestricted access to you. Emotional clarity scares those who benefited from your confusion. Before, you over-explained. Over-justified. Gave in quickly. Now, you pause. Observe. Think. And that completely changes the dynamic. Because manipulation needs immediate reaction. It needs automatic guilt. It needs impulsive emotional responses. When you begin responding with presence instead of fear, the game weakens. You start noticing patterns that once seemed like isolated events. The tones shift when you set a boundary. The affection that fades when you assert yourself. The attempt to make you feel guilty when you don't react as expected. And this doesn't make you cold. It makes you aware. Self-protection is not emotional shutdown. It's the conscious choice not to expose yourself where there is repeated invalidation. It's understanding that not every conversation needs to be fully explained. That not every conflict needs to be resolved by you. You learn that saying less can be healthier than explaining everything. That silence can sometimes be preservation, not avoidance. Clarity also brings grief. Because when you see honestly, you realize that the relationship you tried to save may never have existed in the way you imagined. There was potential. There was hope. But not true reciprocity. And that hurts. It hurts to accept that you loved deeply someone who connected through control. It hurts to realize your openness was used as a tool. But this pain is not regression. It's transition. Clarity doesn't turn you into someone indifferent. It turns you into someone less available for emotional games. And to those who depended on them, that feels like coldness. You don't need to defend yourself from that accusation. You don't need to prove that you still care. You don't need to convince anyone of your humanity. If someone only feels close when you're confused, guilty, or trying to please, that closeness was always conditional. Clarity is when you stop negotiating your dignity in the name of peace. It's when you understand that love should not require constant emotional vigilance. And the truth is simple, though hard to accept. Anyone who is bothered by your boundaries benefited from your lack of them. There comes a moment when the confusion starts to fade. Not because everything has been resolved, but because you stop fighting what you feel. You stop constantly asking yourself if you're overreacting, being unfair, or imagining things. And this moment isn't loud. It's quiet. It's when you begin respecting thoughts you once ignored. You realize you no longer need to convince anyone of your worth. That you don't need to explain your pain for it to be valid. That you don't need to stay in places where your presence demands constant sacrifice. Clarity doesn't come as absolute certainty about the other person. It comes as reconnection with yourself. You begin trusting your perception again. Giving weight to what you feel. Accepting that repeated discomfort is information, not weakness. And that changes everything. You understand that manipulation isn't always overtly cruel. Often, it hides in relationships where only one side grows while the other adapts until disappearing. Where only one is heard. Where only one has emotional space. You also understand that leaving this place doesn't require hatred, revenge, or confrontation. Sometimes, it only requires internal honesty. The quiet decision to stop betraying yourself. Waking up doesn't mean you'll never miss them. It doesn't mean it won't hurt. It means you chose not to live in confusion to maintain an illusion. You're not becoming cold. You're becoming whole. And that may scare those who benefited from your fragmentation. But love that's worth it doesn't ask you to doubt yourself. It doesn't keep you on constant alert. It doesn't make you smaller so it can feel bigger. Healthy love brings expansion. It brings safety. It brings truth. If this video found you in a moment of questioning, know this: you didn't arrive here by accident. Clarity begins when you allow yourself to hear what you've been silencing. You are not confused. You are waking up. And waking up, sometimes, is the loneliest and most liberating act there is.